the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 93.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you today. And just a quick note, tomorrow's episode will not air. I had internet problems and technical difficulties, and the guest was sick, and we're recovering from the flu. And so just everything worked against us to get tomorrow's episode out the door. So we will not have that. We will be back next Tuesday on our regular schedule, though, so stay tuned for that. Also, a pretty big announcement coming up here in just a few episodes as we are approaching episode 100. Right after or right around episode 100, we'll have a pretty big announcement about the show and what's going on. So stay tuned for that. But today, I don't even know what to title today's show because I had such a great time with this episode. Going back and listening to it, we covered so much ground that I'm not even really sure what to say about it other than, Urenna and I just kind of tried to get in there and just try to discuss some of the different things that we see. Obviously, she is more of the expert on this topic than I am, but just some of the things that we see as we look into Africa and how we're going to get that continent and those countries of people power as they become as they move from emerging markets into kind of a first world type marketplace. And so we cover a lot today. We go all of the map, but I think it was a really good discussion, and I think it's an important discussion if you're especially one of those folks like myself who's always looking to do international business. Understanding some of the complexities of these issues and how they work and trying to think through them is a very complicated subject, and there's so many points of view that you really just can't cover it all in one podcast or 100. It's a very deep and complicated issue, but I think Ureena and I did a good job of at least kind of setting the table for some of the discussion in the future. So without further ado, here is Urenna Onyewuchi on all things Africa. Well, I always enjoy getting to talk about Africa, and so it's a pleasure to have you back on the program again today. How are you doing?
Pretty good, Ryan. Thank you. How are you?
Doing well. It's a beautiful day down here in the great state of Texas, and so the weather is nice and cool, and so we are excited. It's not 100 degrees down here, every day anymore, so everything's going well. But let's get into it. There's always a lot to talk about when you talk about Africa, but today I think we're going to focus on something that you hear a lot of talk about, pollution and stuff like that, especially in the U.S., but Africa, of course, it's a big place, but it's an emerging market, as we know, and so you have different regulatory bodies for each country, and they have their own standards, and then you have these areas that don't have access to the grid, and so I would imagine that pollution in Africa is unique in a lot of aspects. Kind of break down for the audience when we're talking about pollution in Africa, especially from a commercial side, an industry side, what that looks like, and what are some of the obstacles that are facing the African nations.
I probably will use Nigeria as a sort of case study or as an example within Africa. So even outside of electricity, while you're driving through the streets, you see a lot of emissions from cars going out, cars and trucks, just lots of black smoke. It tends to be a joke for me whenever I go back to Nigeria, is that I expect that I'm going to have some kind of respiratory problem, coughing or and all that when I get back. And that's just really from driving on the streets, as well as the pollution that just comes out in general. For those people who have ACs, for instance, in their cars, it's always wise to just roll up. And so it's something that for those of us who live outside of the country of Nigeria or some of the other sub-Saharan African countries, we don't think about while we're driving, while you're driving through Texas, me through in Florida or North Carolina, whatever. We're not thinking about that, but then it becomes an issue when you arrive in Nigeria, most of the cities. And so when you talk about obstacles, I think regulation has a big part to play. So, for instance, in the most states in the U.S., right, your cars need to get tested just to check how much NOx and so on is in your car. We don't have that. That doesn't happen as much in, say, Nigeria. And then when we now come down to the issue of power generation, so even for people who are connected to the grid, right? Because we have such poor reliability of power in sub-Saharan Africa, that means that even if you're connected to the grid, you still need some other type of generation. And so most people have diesel generators. Most people, I think, run them for sure at night to help with sleeping. During the day, most people are at work, so they probably don't bother too much with that. But what happens is that at a certain time of the day in most neighborhoods, there's a lot of noise. Because when you start up the generator, it makes a lot of noise, and there's noise throughout while it's on until the next day and it's time to go to work. So you have the noise pollution part of it, and then you have the emissions that are coming out as well. There are technologies that you can add to retrofit or whatever the generators, but then these become cost prohibitive. And for, in countries where the people are not making so much money as it is, people don't, it's not at the forefront of their minds to think about health. What's the pollution doing to me, my ears or to my nose and my lungs and my children and so on. At that point, it just becomes survival, right? I need electricity to power up stuff for cooking, lighting for the kids to do their homework. But then it's just an essential part of what we need to start looking at as we in Africa import different diesel generators or different types of generators into the countries to help with electricity.
Yeah, and on the diesel generators, one of the things that we saw with the hurricanes that have come through the U.S. recently is there's a lot of public notices saying, hey, don't bring your diesel generators inside. That's a safety hazard. It's a health hazard. And if you get to somewhere where you don't have access to Twitter and our government set up to kind of let us know, hey, because if you didn't know that, and that's one of those things that you go, well, okay, yeah, we hear it so often, we know it here, but if you never knew that, you wouldn't even think about it. So there's also just an endangerment to the people if they don't understand that there's a inherent risk in bringing a generator inside the house, and so you probably have issues with that as well.
Yes, and you touch on a very good point. In a lot of Africa is it's a very religious continent. I guess a lot of other places are, but because of that, you tend to see a lot of people who, for instance, there are lots of what you call night vigils in churches where people stay overnight in churches, and so some people have their generators inside, bring them inside the building, for instance, and they, in their minds they're thinking, I don't want my generator to get stolen, or if it's raining and I need electricity, I'm just going to go ahead and put the generator inside my house, not thinking about carbon monoxide and the other hazards that come from there. And, just like you said right now, different stores send out information to let you know this is what you should do and shouldn't do. Don't put it inside your house. Don't do this. Don't do that. Communication, I think, is it's another challenge that we face in Africa where stuff like this is concerned, is letting people know about those hazards. And because these generators are being used regularly anyway, it's tougher to, should I say, without a process in place, it's really tougher to be able to educate people or make them aware of the hazards of generators. For instance, I was in Florida during the Hurricane Irma, and people in residential estates or residential apartment buildings got emails saying, make sure not to, basically giving guidelines on what to do and what not to do with generators. Actually, in some other certain areas, they said don't even run it just because we don't know if you know how to use a generator, so you don't harm those, yourself or anyone else in the building. But then in most African countries, or at least where we have the issues, again, just being able to communicate that is really, really tough. And it's something that we need to work on very deliberately, and something that probably needs to be taught in schools, even outside of just those who are studying environmental science or engineering, is how do we get that type of education and awareness into the layman's hands, right? Because it's everyone basically is using or has generated their houses to supplement what they get from the grid.
Right. I want to circle back around to one of the points you made early on was about regulation, and one of the things that I struggle with is, me and you, we've both been to Africa. We've been various spots where there's people who are poor and they don't have access to energy, and once you get outside the United States, you can really see how big of an impact having access to clean, reliable power is for you. And so, when I went to South Africa for the first time, they did a good job of taking me to some of the very low income areas and some of the nice high income areas, and kind of give me a good comparison to kind of look at. It's hard for me because I sit back and I go, okay, well, you don't want the people, obviously, like with the diesel generators, okay, we want them to be educated. So we want the generator outside, and here's why, mainly because it can kill you if it's inside. We just don't want you to die. That's a very easy one to kind of lay out there. But when you look at broader regulation, for me, it's always a struggle because I sit back and I go, well, I want the people to have access to power. And some people in South Africa have complained to me that they're, we'll call it EPA. I don't know what the exact term for it is in South Africa, but their EPA down there, their restrictions are so tight that it really hampers their government ability to bring people power. So what do you say to that when you have these emerging markets where you're trying to find a proper balance between regulation and getting people power?
It's a really tough question to answer. I think, for instance, those in industry in the U.S., or not those in industry, I'll say executives in the industry, sometimes they find a challenge to manufacturing and commercialization of their products. They find regulation to be tough. But like you said, there has to be a good balance. Now, I think sometimes, we make jokes in obviously I work for a company and I have friends who work for different companies. We make jokes about how sometimes those who make the laws are people who have not really experienced, in a sense, where the shoe hurts, right? So, for instance, you have administrators who don't travel internationally for work, making rules on the do's and the don'ts of what you're allowed to do when you leave the country for work. Now, with some of the regulations, I think it's coming from a good place where they say, they make some really strict or tight regulations that are prohibitive to selling products and manufacturing. And in their minds, they're really doing the right thing. But I think something that we could improve on is going back to modify regulations. And even if it's something that needs to be done frequently, then we need to do it. Because sometimes you put a law in place to protect the people, but then over time, as you collect data or as time goes on, you start to see whether or not the law or regulation you put in place actually makes sense. So I think our inability sometimes to there's a poor maintenance culture, and that's with data, that's with infrastructure, that's with soft type skills that we have in Africa. But I think that the challenge of going back to revise things and modify based on how it's actually working is something that can be improved. And it's probably not just an African problem. I think legal in general in most countries tends to be difficult. But I think, especially because of where Africa is right now, how poor, the poor infrastructure we have in most places, we need to be more on our toes where regulation is concerned.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've tried to talk to the audience on this show about is that I bring on folks all over the spectrum on this show that have varying ideas, and if me and you were to sit down and we were trying to roll out what we think's best for country X, Y, and Z, well, we're going to have disagreements. But one of the consistent themes that I think that we've learned from this show, that I've learned at least, is that just about everyone that I bring on, when I get through the interview, I feel like this person is genuinely concerned about getting people energy. And now, that's not everyone in the business. I get that. And there are bad people in all industries. And so you kind of have to protect, the public's interest, obviously, from that. Right. But I think that we're at a point now where, as energy professionals, whether it's Africa, the U.S., wherever, it doesn't matter. We have to sit down and say, you know what, this is my idea. And my idea is really based upon what I think's best. It's not because I want to harm people. I want to help people. And I feel like some of the regulations, it doesn't matter where you go. Some of the regulations that the government puts in, you sit back and you scratch your head and you go, I don't know why are we doing this? Because this is prohibiting me from rolling out a plan. Now, will my plan work? Well, the market will decide that, obviously, but we want to try it out. And so I feel like when you look at some of these problems, again, it could be we're talking about Africa today, but it could be anywhere. When you talk about some of these problems, it's hard to sit back and look at how regulation works in some of these emerging markets, because you're like, we want to get people access to power because that's really important. And this regulation seems to prohibit this. And then how do you educate the public on, what their opportunity could be, because the government's, kind of blocking you. So it's a very complex issue. But I think one of the things I've learned is people like yourself, other people on the show, is we really just want to get people energy, and hopefully that these type of discussions are starting to happen at the government level. What is your takeaway from that? Do you think that, especially in Africa, that the government, the ministers are starting to go, you know what, maybe we should reevaluate some of these policies so that we can get power to our people?
On the policy side, I'm not sure. I think when you go to different conferences, international conferences, you tend to see delegates from different African governments that show up. Obviously, the show up to learn new things. The question always becomes, what happens with the knowledge that they gain? Do they go back and take that to the top level, or what happens? Because I've heard that for some governments, I think sometimes people are just really uncomfortable with change. So sometimes they will invest in sending delegates to conferences, but then not be willing to apply whatever it is that they've learned. And you bring up a great point, because it's for instance, in the Trump administration, they have different councils for conversations on, manufacturing, on aviation, but basically where you have the president of the country with, officials in his cabinet sitting with the CEOs and the CTOs and so on of these top industries. And that's really, I think that would really, really help our African government, is having those conversations coming to the table, but obviously doing something about the information that they gain from these types of meetings. And even where with commerce and manufacturing, is sometimes I think that the people who come to the table are usually like either really high, top executives and executives of, the bigger companies. But sometimes the voices of the smaller businesses are important, because sometimes that's really where you have most of the issues, right? I don't want to say economies of scale, but for instance, with generators, you find that the really, really smaller ones are the ones that have the most issues with pollution, both noise and gas, or gases. And then the bigger ones are usually better. So sometimes I think we need to get more people to the table for these conversations than those that we already have. So for instance, you have the Dangotes of Africa that have a lot of say, probably, with regulations and policies and all that stuff, which is good. But then we need those who are still struggling. It helps them grow and let the government know, because there are really more of these, I think, smaller businesses, smaller industries than possibly the bigger ones. So we need more of them coming to the table. But you're right. I agree with you on this.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem we see with the environmental side of it is the regulatory side, at least, is also with the business side. We've looked at doing business in various nations in Africa, and it's a lot of work to kind of get through the paperwork and to understand. And it kind of seems like the system is predicated on you partnering with someone there, which there's not necessarily a problem with that, except for if you don't have a good relationship with someone there, it's kind of hard to go in and go, okay, I'm going to risk my business with someone I don't really know. However, at the end of the day, a company like ours, we would love to partner with someone there once we get to know them. But and so it's kind of this, maybe the best motive was, well, we want you to partner with someone because we want you to help bring jobs to the local area. We want you to do this, but. And we're going, okay, yeah, we don't have a problem with that, But you got to understand from our standpoint, we got to kind of get a little business going. We got to understand stuff, and then we can partner with someone. And so it's one of those things where probably the motive might be pure, but the execution just doesn't work out. And I think that goes back to what you were saying a minute ago, which is if politicians, we see this in the U.S. all the time, politicians get to power and they don't understand what it's like to actually do the job that they're governing over, and they put these rules and regulations in place, and you're like, yeah, that just doesn't work. So. No, I think you made a good point.
If I can throw something in there as well, I think some government agencies that show up in the emerging markets, like Nigeria, China, different countries in Africa. For instance, you have USDA, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. You have the EU has their version of it, putting in some of these locations, and it looks like what they're trying to do is help. Bring the right people to the table. So having the right, foreign consultants meet with the local government officials and, company executives to try and get to the table to say, okay, what are the needs and where can we get help for you guys? So some of that is beginning to happen. I think obviously it's going to morph over time as people learn what the advantages are and the disadvantages of those types of meetings. But at least the good thing is that something is being done, I think, to help with the conversations and getting the right answers.
Right, and like we talked about last time, as more people get onto the grid and the world becomes more interconnected, and so you have more Africans that are on the grid that can talk to people here in the U.S. or China or wherever abroad, we become more interconnected. And part of the problem we have today is we look at stuff, we are still kind of operating off of almost a pre-internet mindset, to where folks in Africa are folks in Africa and folks in China are folks in China. Yeah, you could go there, you could see them if you take a boat or a plane. But today's economy, you and me both know this. You can go to Atlanta, Georgia. I think every day of the week there's a flight going from Atlanta to Johannesburg that you can get on every day. And I'm sure there's others, but I just know there's a direct flight from Atlanta, Georgia to Johannesburg. Not counting, I've got a call with someone in South Africa scheduled for Wednesday. So you can do business internationally now in a way that 20, 30 years ago you just couldn't do, and the laws haven't really caught up to, I think, to be able to capture that ability for American companies and African companies to work together and kind of roll back some of those restrictions. And so I think it's not just the regulatory bodies on the energy side that are lacking. I think it's government in general not realizing that people want to do international business. We have the capacity to, we have the technology to, and we have the ability to go to wherever we want to, and so we need to be able to do these things. And that's from working in Africa or Africans working here.
They need to get a little bit more flexible. I'd like to say we need to have people at the table who know what they're talking about, both on the foreign side as well as on the African side, because there have been times where, a foreign entity has come in and said, you guys need A, B, C, D, but in reality, they actually needed only A, right? So they're trying to oversell certain things. So it's that balance, but it's important that Africa learns to bring all the right people to the table, not just foreigners to handle all their problems, but the right mix of African experts and non-African experts, whoever is going to help. But you have to have enough people on the table who are there, who don't have vested interests, but are there to really actually help the continent and really actually there to help the country. That's very important.
Right, and I'll kind of wrap it up with this, but my thoughts are someone asked me one time, are we going to go try to do work in Europe? And I said, you got Germany, you got Great Britain, you got France, you got all these countries who have big, large firms who are a lot better at what they do than we are. There's no reason for us to go there and try to compete. And they said, well, what was advantageous about, we're looking at South America and Africa, and they said, what's advantageous about those spots? I said, well, in some of these areas, what we do is just not done there. Now, there are certain aspects of what we do that's being done there, and it's being done there in a way that we can't replicate. There's certain things about being local you can just never replace. You just can't replace that. And so for us, it's always been a deal of how do you partner with a local company and get in there and do business. But I think the issue in which you touched on a second ago is that if you're going to go through all those hoops, hoops, you almost kind of feel like you have to take the whole pie because you had to jump through all these hoops to get to work down there. So it kind of works against you because you're like, oh man, I got to do this, and this just to get in here for this project. And but you're right. You have to balance that out. And then once you balance it out, what happens is, as we both know, is 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. At some point, the local African firm in at country X, they can do it better than you can because not only do they know you're part of the job, they already have the local expertise. And so then you become almost irrelevant in that market, and which is a good thing for you. You made your money. It's a good thing for the local economy because they're now to self-support themselves in that area. So it really works itself out. But that deregulation and finding that balance, like we talked about, if you're talking about energy regulation for emissions or pollution or whatever, finding that balance where the market can thrive, but you're also trying to protect the people, especially in regions where people don't have access to understanding, what are the dangers of diesel generators or what are the dangers of this, and so giving people that safety net, if you will, while allowing the market to work itself out, it's a tough balance. And so I don't want to be the one making those decisions for sure, but we do want to encourage legislators here and in Africa to try to figure out how to strike that balance. And so I'll give you the final word and let you plug where people can connect with you and find you before we let you out of here today.
Sure. Great. Thank you. So same as always, the IEEE Power Africa handle on Instagram is at IEEE_PES_Power Africa. That's at IEEE_PES_Power Africa. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm available there. But I think for face-to-face meetups, I would encourage people to join us at the IEEE Power Africa conferences that we are basically trying to make annual. So that's a great way to be able to meet with me and have a conversation face-to-face.
Absolutely, and we will link to all of that in the show notes. Well, it was great to talk to you again, and I always love talking about all things Africa, and we will look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.